Let's see how it goes.
We'll start talking at 2 minutes past. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Why am I not giving the option to start now? Oh, they start.
Hi, everybody. We'll be starting in about a minute or so, just waiting for everybody to join.
Thank you. Okay, I think we could start. Just welcome to this Zoom webinar on practical ethics. Our guest today is Edwin Selbst. Actually, Edwin wasn't our first choice. He was actually our third choice, but Joe Biden and Donald Trump weren't available, so we asked him to step in at the last minute. But in all seriousness, Edwin Selbst, expert on the subject, lectures to various bodies and organizations. And welcome, Edwin, to this. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't got the notes, please just put in the chat your email address. I'll pop them off to you straight away. But I'm sure that everybody has them, as far as I can tell. Edwin, you have a couple of announcements about timing. I wonder if you would just tell us how you're going to deal with the time and breaks, etc.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. So just from a timing perspective, because we're on a webinar, I thought it would be best. So we're going to run for about an hour. So then at about 2 o'clock or so, depending on where I am with the slides and the case studies and that, we'll break for literally a 5-minute leg stretch, body break, whatever you need. And then at about 3 o'clock, we'll break for another 15 minutes or so for tea break, whatever you need, and then hopefully finish around 4 o'clock.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for joining. As I said, I think, Edwin, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I suppose it's an honor to be considered third after Trump and Biden. So thanks very much, and I hope everybody's going to enjoy this session. If you do have any questions, please, I'd prefer if you unmute yourself and raise the question when I'm on the slide. That's generally the way I work. I find that engages better. If, however, you are too shy, I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, but you are welcome to submit a question in the Q&A, and then Stan and Danny will be then looking out for them, and then they'll unmute themselves and raise the question. So please, whatever you're comfortable with, let's then proceed. So what we've got on the slides for today, on the ethics topics, is we're going to look at understanding ethics, and very importantly, understanding your own character. Why is that important? The reason understanding your character is important is if you don't understand how you are predispositioned, well, then it's unlikely that you are aware how your own subjectivity will affect your decision making in dealing with ethical challenges. We'll then be touching on the philosophy of ethics, understanding different philosophical approaches to ethics. We'll then look at a scenario of different ethical dilemmas, some case studies there again, and that's what you'll need the workbook for. Can I just ask everybody, from a show of hands, we've got close on 50 participants, if you can just raise your hand if you've got the workbook. You can just raise your hand, everybody. I don't know, can't see any hands being raised. Just don't know. I hope everybody's got the workbook, because we are going to be referring to that workbook that was sent out with the slides. It looks like that. That's the heading. It's just a 19-page document. So if you haven't got that, please put something in the chat so that we can just make sure that you get that, because that's going to form quite a important part of today's discussion. We're then going to be looking at different codes of ethics, and we'll see the similarities there as to why do we need them, what is in common, what is different, some from a business perspective, but some from even a religious perspective. We'll then look at decision-making tools, how there are different approaches that are available to assist, I should say, yourselves in making ethical choices. And then we'll be looking at a couple more of scenarios, some case studies, etc., as to how one then goes about applying one's mind in ethical dilemmas. The case studies have been set from a very general perspective, but the purpose thereof is to get your minds thinking. And then I'm not sure from a timing perspective, it'll all depend on the interaction. I'm hoping we'll have some people that will be willing to share their views as we go through the case studies. But depending on timing, we may not get through all of the case studies, but the purpose thereof is not to go through the case studies, but more for you to understand how you think, how you apply your mind, and just give yourselves a bit of opportunity in practical application of what we're actually learning. So I think then let's then have a look at some of the actual material that we wanting to go through. So the first question I'd like to pose is, why do we need ethics? Any thoughts? I'm going to let that simmer in your heads. I'm looking at the questions, so please, any thoughts? Why do we need ethics? What's the purpose of ethics? Anybody want to propose an answer? Okay, so I think when it comes to ethics, we need to understand that the purpose is to make sure that when we act in a business environment, that we get it right the first time, that we do things properly, and hopefully we then able to sleep well at night. Ethics is particularly influenced by independence, because independence has a significant impact on whether or not one will be able to be objective in the scenario, in the challenge that is being faced. And it's important to realize that professional accountants need to incorporate ethics, and particularly independence, in their decision making as early as possible. So when should that start? Believe it or not, before you even start the planning of any engagement. And this applies to those of you in a tax environment, those of you in an audit. If you're looking at accepting an engagement, we need to make sure that you consider and evaluate. You consider and evaluate your independence before you actually accept the engagement. Because, you know, if you're sitting at a client, if you're doing their tax, you've accepted the client, you've invested hours in preparing their tax return, and now you have a question on what they're asking you to do from an ethical perspective. Well, you're already impaired because you have a financial interest, the time that you've spent. The same with an audit, the same with any engagement. And therefore, when it comes to ethics, yes, there's different levels of requirements. We'll have a look at it in terms of the code. Independence needs to be enhanced when you're dealing with listed entities, where you're dealing with entities that may be of a public interest nature, where you have a self-interest, or where you have different types of services that you're offering. It's important to realize that one needs to focus on ethics and independence in particular beyond just the period in which you are physically or actively engaged in the relationship. And ethics can be compromised as a result of business associations, discussions. Sorry, I was just checking the chat if there was anything for me there. And it's important to realize that there needs to be adequate consideration of your ethical decision-making and how you've applied professional judgment in making ethical decisions. From the RBA code's perspective, there's been recent changes in the code, whereby there's now what they call a stand-back approach, or the reasonable and informed third-party test. And what does that mean? It means that, well, have I, as a businessman, applied my technical knowledge to arrive at a decision which is reasonably sound? And therefore, when one is engaged in any activity, be that the audit of financial statements, the review of financial statements, or any other area in which you are in a position of trust, the person needs to evaluate and consider how they've applied their mind. Are they just ticking the boxes to try and make sure that there's a checklist and they can demonstrate that they've arrived at the appropriate decision? Or are they actually living an ethical lifestyle and making sure that they are inculcating that in their business relationships and interactions with professionals. So when it comes to your ethical character, so we need to understand what is ethics and how are your own personal ethics affected. So let's understand then when it comes to ethics. So ethics are defined as the moral principles governing or influencing the way in which a person will behave. What that basically means is how you are going to react in a given situation. Now, what has a direct influence on your ethics is your morals. And your morals are those standards of behavior or principles of right and wrong. Now, generally, our morals are influenced by our upbringing, by our religion, by society, by the people with which we interact. And while certain things can be right or wrong, black or white, well, those are the simpler aspects in which one would need to engage and arrive at a decision. You know, is it wrong to steal? I don't think we would have anybody here saying that that's a behavior that would be accepted. But there are what they call grey areas. And the grey areas are aspects which are not clearly defined. And therefore, what happens is, depending on one's morals, that would influence their ethical behavior in certain scenarios. So I'm going to ask you, we're going to try and see if we can get a vote going again. I'm going to ask, does anybody believe it is correct to take money from petty cash at the office for personal use? Is there anybody who thinks that that's okay? Okay, can't see any hands going up, so I'm hoping it means you're not raising it because you've actively decided that that's incorrect. But then when it comes to something like theft, let's take it a step further. I mean, nobody would say that it's correct to steal money. But what about something like stationery? What if I went to the office, took the pen home and used it for personal use? Another example that comes to mind is, you know, taking stationery home for your other personal family members. Something, another degree of theft. So depending on our morals will determine where we believe theft and integrity stands and what is permissible or not. And therefore, what ethics tries to do is it tries to codify and define the business practices as to what is correct or not, to take into account people's different moral upbringing. And I think in South Africa, we have a particular challenge in this area because of, let's just call it corruption, that is pervasive throughout the economy, and that we're still, unfortunately, having to live through and try and overcome. So the question we need to then ask is, well, how then does one's character play a role in understanding your morals and ultimately influencing your ethical behavior? So it's in this regard that I'm going to ask you now to look at this, listen to this video from the perspective of, is this somebody that you can relate to or not? What is this person's moral stating? What is your view of the way in which they behave?
And the butchery begins. Any pugilist worth his salt knows when someone's on the ropes, that's when you throw a combination to the gut and a left hook to the jaw. In Gaffney, we had our own brand of diplomacy. Shake with your right hand, but hold a rock in your left. I've always loathed the necessity of sleep. Like death, it puts even the most powerful men on their backs. The heart can choke the mind when all its blood flows back onto itself. There can be no false steps now. The higher up the mountain, the more treacherous the path. Good things happen to good people. Avoid wars you can't win, and never raise your flag for an asinine cause like slavery. When the money's coming your way, you don't ask any questions. This hurts us both, but it's not my wound to suture. Claire must be the surgeon. Only she can stop the bleeding. The road to power is paved with hypocrisy and casualties. Never regret. It's not beginning the story that I fear. It's not knowing how it will end. Everyone is fair game now. There are two types of vice presidents, doormats and matadors. Which do you think I intend to be? The only thing more satisfying than convincing someone to do what I want is failing to persuade them on purpose. It's like a do not enter sign. It just begs you to walk through the door. From the lion's den to a pack of wolves, when you're fresh meat, kill and throw them something fresher. Even Achilles was only as strong as his heel. Cry havoc, said he who fought chaos with chaos and let slip the dogs of war. Every kitten grows up to be a cat. They seem so harmless at first, small, quiet, lapping up their saucer of milk. But once their claws get long enough, they draw blood, sometimes from the hand that feeds them. For those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted. Welcome back.
Right, so that was a short video clip. I'm just going to leave it on the black screen for the moment. As to a particular character, some of you may admire, some of you may identify with, some of you may despise. But the purpose was to see how a person can behave in different scenarios. And some of the quotes I just want to discuss with you is, if the money comes to you, do not ask any questions, was one of the comments made. And we need to realize that, yes, we all have different beliefs as to how we earn our money, but we do need to realize that if that money is tainted, eventually it's going to catch up with one. The other comment that Blair Underwood made in this movie is that the only thing that is more satisfying in convincing someone to do what I want is failing to persuade them on purpose. It's like a do not enter sign, just begging you to walk through the door. So sometimes a person can use their power, and I think we need to be very aware of the roles that we play as chartered accountants. Some of you also registered auditors. that because of this position of authority, because of this level of assurance that is being sometimes implied by your profession in the work that you do on any services that you offer, we need to just make sure that we're displaying a sign that is adequate and of the highest integrity in terms of the way in which we should be behaving in terms of the code of ethics. And then the last comment I'd just like to stress is the one that sort of resonates with me quite scarily, where the statement was made, for those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted. So I think we need to be very aware of how we behave, how our impact on society and on others can influence them, as well as the manner in which we engage. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to turn to your workbooks, and if you turn to the workbooks, I'm going to ask you to go to page 3, which I'm hoping you can see on the screen. It says values identification. And what I want you to do is spend a couple of minutes highlighting the 10 values that are most important to you as a person. So if you can then just look at that, I hope you've got it printed out. If not, just make a note of them, because we're going to be working with this for probably the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to be quiet for a while, give you some time to think. So we're looking for you to highlight, it says so on the top there, select the 10 most important values that you identify.
If anyone's still looking for the workbook, it's in the chat. I've set a link.
I'll give you another minute or so just to finish that up. Okay, right. I'd now like to ask you all to, of those 10 values that you've identified, to now narrow them down to 5. So of those 10, see which of the 5 are more important in your life. I'll give you about a minute to do that. If I can ask you to finish up, we'll be starting shortly, so we're looking for 5. Okay, and then finally, if I can ask you to reduce that to your top 3. Give you a couple of seconds to choose your top 3. I'm then going to ask if anybody is brave enough to post on the Q&A or share their views as to what their top 3 were. So if you can think about that, if you're willing to share that, I'd appreciate that. Right, so any thoughts? Can anybody willing to be a bit more interactive, make it a bit more interesting? Anybody willing to share their thoughts? In the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself. Or if you have any other questions on what we've covered as well, please, I'm happy to take them now. Okay. Anybody want to volunteer anything? Okay, so one person has said cooperating with others, helping those in need, and behaving ethically. Another person has said enjoying what you do. I think that's the number one. So thanks very much. Another comment has included a response that religion is very important to them. So thanks very much to everybody for participating, and it's very interesting. We've also had feeling excited and stimulated, and self-development. That together with enjoying what you do were the three of one person. And then another comment is organized and dependable, cooperation with others, and behaving ethically. Building a family, enjoying what you do. So thanks very much for the discussion. And, you know, it's probably the first time when I've been discussing this amongst accountants that I haven't had the one at the bottom over here. I'm just going to try and see if this is going to work. You should be able to see the mouse now. Truth and integrity, but I suppose behaving ethically does incorporate that as well. So the purpose of this exercise was to understand what resonates with you. And what's very interesting is, and while I'm going to make the statement, it doesn't always apply, but I'm going to generalize anyway, is that women are generally more compassionate, empathetic, and they bring that into the business and the way in which they interact with people. Whereas men, and I know myself in particular, sometimes I've been told that when it comes to emotions, I'm sometimes, I've been called a brick wall because it's not something that resonates with me, and it's something that, being aware of, I've had to work quite hard on in terms of inculcating in my business relationships. So what I want us now to do is to take these values that we've come up with and define them into a purpose statement. So on the next page is where I need you to then look at each value and put them into some sort of purpose statement. What is success? How does it mean? How does this influence you? So if you're a bit confused, let me give you an example of what I mean. So if, for example, I had chosen being productive as one of those values that define myself, I could then put that into a sentence by saying, for me, being productive means feeling good about what I've accomplished at the end of the day. So take each one of your top three values and please inculcate that into a statement so that you can outline what those values mean for you. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, I'll still give you another minute or two. Okay, if you can start finishing off, please. Right. Thanks, everyone. And then finally, what we need to do is sort of bring it all together in terms of creating your own value statement. For example, in my life, I would like to get the most out of each day by being as productive as possible. For me, being productive means feeling good about what I have accomplished at the end of the day. It is important to me to do this in a way that allows me to make enough money that I feel secure and able to get the things that I both need and want, as well as I need to feel challenged in my life. I like overcoming new problems and having new experiences. So in the at the bottom of this page, if you can try and find, compose your final value statement. I'll give you a couple of minutes to come up with that. Okay, we're going to start off again in about a minute or so. So if you can just try and pull that all together. Right. So while you people have been thinking, we've had some other contributions. Values that people resonate with was behaving ethically, enjoying what you do, and helping those in need, religion or spirituality, and truth and integrity. We've also had people saying cooperating with others to encourage trust and reliability, helping others to promote Ubuntu, behaving in a manner that will demonstrate credibility and fairness. Is there anybody who's willing to share their value statement, either verbally or by typing it in the Q&A or the chat, whatever you're comfortable with? If you feel like sharing that, please do that. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to type up for your 3 different values. You can come up with your statement. Okay, can't see anything coming through. But I think what's important to realize then is to understand how the impact of your own personal values will have a direct impact on the way in which you behave in the business environment from an ethical perspective. So to take some of the examples that came through, for example, one of the people said cooperation with others. Now, somebody who has that as one of their values, well, that means that there's a possibility that they're more likely to be influenced by others. Enjoying what you do may sound very positive, but could have a negative impact in terms of the way in which it could impact your behavior if you're doing something that you don't enjoy because it's not one of your strengths. I don't know, for some people that may be auditing, other people that may be tax from a business environment perspective. Well, then that's likely to have a negative impact on your ethical behavior, and the converse as well. If you're doing what you enjoy, well, then that would positively impact your behavior. So when it then comes to understanding then how we then behave, so let's then have a look at then how you would handle each of the following situations. So your supervisor is homesick. He called you to ask you to tell anyone that asks that he is on a business trip. So forget about the code for now. How would you personally handle this scenario? What would you do? Any thoughts? Welcome to submit your responses in the chat or the Q&A. One person responding in the Q&A, I won't tell him. I won't lie for that person. Another comment, do as I'm told. This is your supervisor. So here are two totally different responses to the same scenario based on your personal values as to how you would resolve or interact or deal with the scenario. So put your thinking caps on again. Thanks very much for the responses. In the following scenario, you have found out that a particular team in your company will be laid off in 6 months. Your best friend is on that team, and you're in a position of authority, but you've been asked to keep this confidential. How would you react? Think about it, and you're welcome to submit it in the Q&A, your responses, or the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. I'll just give you a couple more minutes. One comment, not my place to inform the person. So their confidentiality being a value that resonates very strongly with the person. Other comments, keep it confidential. Workplace and personal life, friends, should be kept apart. Another comment, I would keep it quiet. Somebody else saying, I will have to tell my friend in confidence. Another comment, tell your friend to get serious about starting up that side of the business he's been thinking about. Now, that last comment, and thanks very much for the discussion from everyone, is a very interesting comment, because I think that is a way in which one is trying to manage the conflict with the confidentiality and the loyalty in such a way that you're not breaching confidentiality, but at the same time trying to encourage the person to tell them, look, you need to be careful. Things may be turning around, but just sort of nudging the person without even saying that there's a problem. So thanks very much for the discussion, and I think this is what adds to the understanding. I think, when it comes to confidentiality, I was at a auditing practice many years ago, and what actually happened was the bonus provisions and increases for the subsequent year were unfortunately left on the photostat machine, which was used as the scanner. And would you believe it if I told you a certain individual found it? Not only did they keep it, but they actually made a copy of it and distributed to every single employee in the organization. An extreme example, but I think this is a very clear and obvious case where there's been a lack of integrity. Let's then have a look at some other scenarios. One of your clients offered you free tickets to a major gala coming up. Your company prohibits accepting gifts. What would you do? Money's tight. We're in the middle of COVID. Haven't been out. What are your thoughts? I'll give you a couple of minutes to submit your responses. Really appreciate the contributions and interaction we've had so far, so please keep it coming. One comment, won't accept the gift. Another person also saying they'll decline. Another comment, decline, but advise them the reason for your declining the offer. You know, I think we need to realize that something as simple like this has caused major problems in this country. If we look at what happened with a certain prominent wedding linked to corruption in this country, we see there's been accepting of gifts to go there. And, you know, we need to realize that no matter how subtle these things are, unfortunately, they do have an impact on the your decision making and impairs your independence. In terms of the final scenario, sorry, just one more comment just before we move on, and that is that somebody commenting saying, Danny actually saying that he knows someone who was offered rugby tickets in front of the audit partner, but their policy was not to accept the gifts over a specific value. So he was able to accept it, as it was known that the face value of the tickets was zero. I think, Danny, that's an interesting one, but I think there we would have to, even though the face value may be zero, but the ability to attend the rugby game and be at the stadium has a commercial value. And I think we need to be very careful saying, well, actually, it's not costing them anything, because there is a commercial value to that. I also think it's important to realize that when one looks at these different scenarios, that we need to be very aware of what the company policy is and what the potential impact is. I'm aware of a certain condiments company that used to offer their used to offer some of their clients, customers, and the auditors as well a hamper of all their products when you completed the audit, or even when you came to do the stock take. Now, very interestingly, it was found out that they were keeping two sets of books. And believe it or not, this was a listed company. They had two invoicing systems, two data systems. The one was going through the accounting records and the other was not. A listed company. So we need to just be aware that there's a risk out there and people could be subtly trying to influence your behavior. So I think this probably brings us to an opportune time, literally for a 5-minute leg stretch. Just going to literally give you a comfort break, whatever you need. So if you can please synchronize your watches, we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thanks a lot. Right, if you can take your seats, we'll be starting very shortly. Right, so thanks very much, everyone. Let's continue. Just a point of clarity from Danny, just saying that the company policy was gifts of above 1,000 Rand, and that these tickets then were below 1,000 Rand in terms of the policy. And remember, every firm needs to have a policy as to what's allowed and what is not, what needs to be reported in a register, and that register needs to be maintained just to evaluate the behavior of the entity. So let's then move on. And we're all accountants. We're all out there to run, hopefully, an ethical business. But why should we bother with ethics? Well, it's been proven that customers choose ethics. If there is ethical behavior, it builds customer loyalty. Customers appreciate ethics. People like to deal with honest people. If you can inculcate a culture of ethical behavior at your organization, your employees are more likely to be loyal. Staff turnover is low. Training needs to reduce as a result of that. Ethical companies are more productive. And, well, hopefully there'll be no legal costs trying to defend, be that labor disputes or anything else. You know, when it comes to car sales people, you know, if you had one person that was selling a stolen car and the other that sort of gives you the full disclosure of the vehicle's past, I think it's obvious we all prefer dealing with honest people. You know, I'm aware of a situation where a certain employee at a company was undercharged, person doing quite a menial job. And what happened was they realized, because of compassion and honesty, those two values driving their behavior, that they were concerned that the employee may get reprimanded because they'll do a stock count or something at the end of the month, and it'll be found out that this was the only person that was dealing with this unusual item. And therefore, they then realized, no, they don't want to take the chance that this person may be have disciplinary action taken against them, and then went to the back to the company where they bought the product from to make sure that it was adequately paid for. I think we need to realize that if you are fair to people, they'll be fair to you. And studies show that ethical employees take, for example, less sick days. They're typically more productive and less likely to do personal things during office hours. But while some of that may be obvious, many people don't see the financial payoff for ethical behavior. Why give up that extra 200 Rand a month in a false business travel claim expense? The company doesn't need it. and nor do you. So one needs to be careful in terms of reports that one's completing. In no matter what way you engage, one needs to then just make sure that the culture of ethical behavior is inculcated, because when your employees then communicate, particularly with your clients, this is something that drives behavior and drives loyalty. So moving on then, let's then have a look at the philosophy of ethics. So we've been discussing your values, we've been discussing how you apply that and the benefits of that. But now let's understand, based on those values, how does one then behave, and what determines a person's behavior in the business? So the first aspect is there's something called the golden rule. And what the golden rule does is it takes the concept of do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, with the central idea that that everyone wants to be treated well. The challenge that one has with such a philosophy is that, well, people have different standards of behavior, and what may be considered okay by some people may be considered unethical by others. Another consideration is the golden mean. And what that philosophy looks at, developed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, is he believed that the key to ethical behavior is moderation or courage. For example, acting rashly isn't a good idea, but neither is being a coward. The virtuous behavior would be courage, which is the halfway point between the two. The middle point between acting rashly versus being a coward. So avoiding the issue. Other philosophical concepts are utilitarianism, where one looks at most benefit versus the least cost. So one evaluates that based on the solution that seems to benefit the most number of people at the lowest cost to society. This is a philosophy that originated in England in the 19th century. The challenges with utilitarianism is there are a few key problems with this philosophy. The first problem is deciding what factors to weigh. Do you look at, for example, purely financial, purely social, or a combination of social and financial considerations? The other challenge that one has is, well, if we're looking at the benefit, well, from whose perspective do we evaluate those benefits? Let's take a simple scenario. A person is looking to chop down a forest. Let's say this forest is in Knysna, which has the significant environmental issues and protection. Now, if we evaluate it based on the residents, based on the wildlife that's there, we arrive at a different answer if you look at it from the shareholders' point of view. What about the people that actually get the jobs that could be the local community as well, that then have employment opportunities. So there's a bit of a challenge in evaluating how you give precedence to which respective parties. And then finally, one looks at the final challenge with utilitarianism is it doesn't look at the human factors, such as exceptions or extenuating circumstances. It just looks at, well, overall, where's the best? Where's it going to be the best for the majority of people? And then the categorical imperative. So the categorical imperative was developed by Immanuel Kant and looks at moral development and that one needs to apply consistency. This 18th century philosopher was of the view that one rule must be developed and applied to everyone and act only according to that point of view, and this should then become universal law. Basically, what Kant is saying is that the rule should apply forever, and, for example, stealing is wrong. Once that rule has been set up, well, anybody who steals must face the consequences. The obvious problem with such a philosophical view is it doesn't allow for exceptions, doesn't allow people to change their mind. And sometimes it is unjust or unfair. It doesn't take into account the reason why something may have been done. Interesting comment is that the principle of charity has not been mentioned. So I think that when we look at ethical decisions, charity goes to that aspect of being socially responsible, making sure that others have what you have, etc. Valid point, thank you. And the final philosophical approach that I'd like to discuss is that of utopianism, where you fulfill the needs and rights of everyone. Now, some people believe that this is the ultimate level of ethical behavior. But the challenge that we have, and interestingly, they say that when it comes to utopianism, there are very few individuals in the world that are able to operate at such a level. This philosophy offers the view that everyone's needs and rights should be fulfilled. It sounds very nice in principle, but is often impractical. There have been many movies made as to ethical challenges. Just the name of the one escapes me. I don't remember if it was Denzel Washington. No, I think it was somebody else where he breaks into a hospital and is caught stealing. And there's the entire movie that was made because his child needed certain medication and he didn't have the funds to be able to afford it. So I think that we need to be aware that there is a challenge with each of these different philosophies. Some of these philosophies may resonate more with us than others because of their charitable nature, because of their social responsibility, whereas others, because we're more direct, consistent, I'm scared to say sometimes less empathetic, we may resonate with others. But I think we need to evaluate these and consider how then we need to apply them in practice. So I've been doing some talking for a while now. So what I'm going to be doing now is we're going to go back to your workbooks now. So if I can ask everyone to go to the following scenarios. Sorry, I just want to double check on the slides. Give me one moment. So we've got some slight differences between the slides here, but what I'd like you to do is that to focus on these we've pretty much discussed. So yeah, so if you go to page 8 of your workbooks, and that will then discuss each of the following scenarios. So if I'm going to put this up now on the slide, and then we'll then go through these one at a time. So you're the chief engineer that has just discovered a potentially major problem with the latest SUV for rollover. You've had an opportunity to outsource production of your rollover SUV to a small offshore company with a questionable reputation. Your assistant has just confessed. Sorry, that's the next one. So these 2 points are one scenario. And if I can ask you to turn to your workbook, and what I'd like you to try and do is, based on these different ethical or philosophical approaches, try and apply your mind. What would the result be in terms of the resolution of the discussion that we've just had? So there's a bit more information on the actual slide. In the workbook. There's a problem with the braking power. The engineer estimates that this is about $2 million to fix the problem. Lawyer estimates that lawsuits will be minimal and only cost the company $250,000. In the past, issues like this have caused significant legal problems, and vehicles have been produced with known issues. So the question is, applying these different approaches, what would you arrive at? How would you deal with the situation? So I'll give you about 5 minutes to apply your mind, and then we'll move on. while you're working through it, if you do have any questions or comments on anything we've discussed so far, or on this case study, you want to share your views, please feel free to do so, and I'll discuss that just now. Right, I'll give you a short while longer. Right, so if we look at the different philosophical approaches, in terms of the evaluation of the scenario, if it were the golden rule, well, do unto others as you would want done unto yourself, well, that philosophical approach would be look at the what's the right thing to do, how would you like to be treated, and see, based on that, well, who would like to be driving around in a car with, I think we said, faulty brakes? That's a risk that we wouldn't want to accept, and therefore we would fix it. The golden mean would be arrive at a similar thing. Being a coward would mean running away from the problem. Taking a stand would be seeing whether or not you can do anything about it, and that moderation of courage would mean recalling the vehicles and actually making sure that they fixed. The utilitarianism scenario gives you a very interesting evaluation. Well, the most benefit, the least cost. Once again, that challenge is to who? Well, if you evaluate it from the perspective of the company, you arrive at a very scary answer, because that would say, well, 2 million to fix it versus 250,000 potential legal costs in the future. We can see this scenario arrives at potentially an unethical decision based on a philosophy of ethics. The categorical imperative rule would say, well, if we've made a rule that, well, if there are problems we need to recall, then we'll do it. If we've made a rule that, well, we just look at it based on the financial circumstances, then we'll stick to that. And from a utopianism perspective, how can everyone benefit? Very difficult, because of the views of everybody. If you look at the right to life as a reason to act, well, then we're saying we need to make sure that the vehicles are recalled and fixed, because everybody's right to life is protected under those circumstances. But, you know, you could look at it from the perspective of financial needs, profits, and then while these aren't exactly ethical values, you know, if that's what's driving behavior in an organization, well, even with utopianism, the decision could be justified for an unethical decision. So I think just to raise the comment that was expressed, that is that somebody else is saying that they will fix the problem regardless of the cost. The cost can be dealt with and the tax benefits utilized. That's the right thing to do. So thanks for the discussion. I think in terms of the rest of the case studies, let's just then understand them. So your assistant has just confessed to pilfering $500 from the company's petty cash fund. Your thoughts, what would you do under such scenarios? We're not going to go through the different philosophical discussions as to how you would evaluate. What would you do under this scenario? Any thoughts? While you're thinking of that one, you were cleaning up your son's room and you found a book from a school he attended several years ago. What do? You're walking down the road and you spot a mugging taking place. What's your reaction? Please feel free to contribute to any of these as to how you believe you should behave. What would you do? And just indicate your response with a number that you're thinking, that you're responding to, please. So I'll give you a minute or so just to think about those. Okay, please feel free to contribute anything. One comment received so far is with scenario 3, the person said that, well, stealing is stealing, and therefore, well, this is a lack of trust now. On what basis would you be able to trust the person again? And therefore, this warrants the labor processes to be followed and ultimately dismissal. Another comment is confront the issue and rectify. Ask the person to put the petty cash back. And in the second scenario, take the book back to school and evaluate the situation in terms of the mugging, see how you can help, call for help, or whatever you can do, but not just become a bystander. So I think what we need to realize, sorry, just two other comments. Take the book back to school. 2 comments coming through. I think, when we're standing back and offering advice, it's very easy. We know it's the right thing. But would the situation change if there's costs involved? Or let's say you've moved out of the town in which you, where this library or school is. This was in Cape Town, you've relocated to Joburg or vice versa. Sometimes money has a way of discouraging the correct behavior. And I think the purpose of these case studies is for us to think and apply our minds to evaluate what is the correct values that we resonate with based on those value statements, and on that basis then, how should we then be behaving? So thanks everyone for your contributions. So I think it's important to realize that, yes, depending on the tools, the different philosophical evaluations that you may have employed, you may have arrived at a different answer. Some tools, because of their biases, do not arrive at the right answer, because circumstances sometimes need to be taken into account, and whereas the actions may be inappropriate, let's refer to that case of the $500 being stolen from petty cash, the circumstances may warrant a different behavior. And I think it's clear that one needs to look at circumstances, but one also needs to apply ethics and rules in business decisions, and very importantly, in the business environment. When you're faced with a decision, is this a client I can accept or not? What sort of services am I going to be offering? Are those services in conflict with my code, with the Companies Act requirements? Is there anything that the code allows me to introduce as a safeguard, for example? Or is this something where no safeguard is allowed, and therefore one needs to excuse oneself from the relationship? Another comment is with regard to scenario number 5, which was the mugging, somebody saying, let's use social media. Person may not have the courage to face the robber, but socials are fast. Restoration may be reached much quicker than a danger I may subject myself to. So take a recording of it, seeing whether or not that can be posted. I mean, a very interesting a response to the scenario. Using modern technology, we've seen it has huge outreach, huge publicity, and then appropriate action can be taken. Thanks very much for that contribution. So then one final scenario that I'd like to discuss with you before we look at some of the tools that are available. And that is, you know, we've spoken about different ethical challenges. I'm not sure how many of these any of you have actually experienced, but I think we need to be aware of them from a business perspective, but also in terms of the services that we offer. Because if we have any ethical questions on any of our clients, we should be evaluating that and seeing whether or not these are clients that we wish to be associated with. An example that comes to mind is a certain entity which it was a school, not even in Gauteng, that I was consulted about. And the practitioner in one of the other provinces was aware of certain unethical behavior happening whereby certain laws of the Schools Act were not being followed. There were 3 chartered accountants sitting on the school's governing board, and they were all trying to convince the auditor that the manner in which the governing body was dealing with this was appropriate. Just to make it a bit more practical, what actually transpired is that there's a requirement in the Schools Act that a entity that the school needs to disclose the amounts that are paid to the employees of the school, particularly the principal. This school was a private school and had secured the services of a well-respected principal, but they had to pay a significant premium and almost above what the school could afford. And what they did is they funded the difference between what the school was willing to pay versus what the principal was asking by way of a trust that was set up for bursaries for people that couldn't afford the fees of the school. And if you think that was bad enough, to try and disguise it, they actually paid funds from the school into the bank account of one of the businesses operated by a chartered accountant, and then paid that to the school, and it went on to the principal as almost like I forget exactly what they called it. But, you know, I think we all faced sometimes with these challenges, some of us more often than others. But the purpose is to use these philosophical approaches to understand your values and see how then we can act. The final ethical case study I'd like to deal with is the following scenario, and this once again is in your workbooks. I'm just going to see if I can find it quickly for you. Okay, so it's on page 13 of 19, and it speaks about Merck Pharmaceuticals. So Merck Pharmaceuticals is a company that has been operating, assisting many African countries. It's as well as those in Central and South America. There is something called river blindness, and it's caused by an insect-borne disease that results in severe itching. Some people had even been known to commit suicide as a result of the discomfort. The disease is so prevalent that, according to the World Health Organization, some 4 decades ago, it was believed to be the second largest infectious disease causing blindness. In 1979, Merck Pharmaceuticals discovered that one of the company's best-selling veterinarian drugs might cure this terrible illness, and that it blinded millions. However, there were several problems with the discovery. Developing a drug suitable for humans would take millions of dollars. The drug might be sold in the black market and reduce the profits of the veterinary drug, harming the company's financial viability, and developing a way to get the drug to afflicted areas and people could be costly and difficult, as there were no distribution channels in place. Despite the challenges, Merck went ahead and developed a human version of the drug at their own cost. They also worked with the World Health Organization and the World Bank and other governmental agencies to get the treatment to those in need and to ensure that it did not appear on the black market. To date, the company had treated over 530 million people for blindness. They've also given this to millions to prevent the disease. Merck has made no direct profits from this 20-year effort, yet has mandated that they will continue to donate their product. The reason? They believe that it's their moral obligation to help those people that are sick. The question I'd like to ask you is, do you believe Merck are acting ethically? What are your thoughts? So that's the scenario. They've developed it at their own cost. They've worked with these different agencies, and they've decided they are going to continue to donate their product. Are Merck acting ethically? Your thoughts? I'll give you a couple of moments to consider. Or maybe it'll help if you just look at the page 14 of your case study, your workbook, and go through those 4 questions. Don't worry about the philosophical aspect, just if you can look at from the different perspectives 1, 2, and 3. And then if you can, you're welcome to write it in the book there. You're welcome to submit it in the chat. I'll give you a couple of minutes to consider that. Thank you. I'll give you about another minute or so, minute or two, just to see. And please do feel free if you've got any comments you wish to raise, and please share them in the chat or the Q&A. Hi. So I think from the perspective of comments raised that, well, they've acted ethically, they have helped people without any direct obligation or benefit. The drug was prepared in a manner that is suitable for humans, and isn't that the right action? So I suppose it depends. Well, and it's, I think in terms of the environment in which the world is now moving around corporate social responsibility and integrated reporting, I agree with this comment that Sam's made to everyone, that yes, this seems to be the correct behavior. However, from the perspective of the stockholders, well, if the stockholders view the purpose of the entity is to produce profits, well, maybe that isn't necessarily the right response. The stockholder may say, well, I'm entitled to choose which charities I want to donate to. And I would prefer a larger dividend and then give on a donation to whoever I decide. Versus others might say, no, I'm happy with the entity to make donations because I value that from a corporate social responsibility perspective. This is a company that has manufactured commercial medicines and now is utilizing it for the benefit of the human race. From the Merck employees' perspective, let's look at it and try and adapt it to a COVID scenario. If this is in a situation where potentially we're dealing with a scenario whereby the entity is facing retrenchments of employees, well, one can argue, is this the right decision? Should it not be looking after its employees? Another comment, the person believes that this is the company is acting sincerely. They might or might not get future publicity. The point is that they've reached out and helped people, and well done to them. It's an ethical decision. So when it comes to our own behavior, we need to make sure that we're comfortable. We need to evaluate who could be affected by our decision, and then evaluate and see how we would address this. So in terms of then timing, I think we've reached a time now where let's break for that 15-minute refreshment break, whatever you'd like, help yourself, and then we'll be back at just after 1:15. Thanks then. Right, please take your seats, everybody. We'll be starting again shortly. Right, welcome back, everyone. So I think in terms of the last 45 minutes, I think we're heading nicely on track to finish on time. We're now going to be looking at the aspect of what must one do to avoid ethical situations. So just some tips for you to take into account. So the first aspect is that one must make sure that your ethical expectations are quite clear. I remember many years ago, I took on a particular client. They were behind in VAT, PAYE, and tax returns, and obviously their tax as well. And the condition of taking them on was, well, please be aware that the intention is to get everything up to speed, catch up everything, make an appointment with SARS, come up, present a payment plan to the organization that's been prepared based on budgets and cash flows and say, right, this is the amount, this is the penalties, this is the interest, etc. Would you be willing to waive penalties, interest, and this is the way forward. So what's important is that, you know, if you can define your strategies up front, that leads to a much better success rate. When dealing with business, particularly in challenging financial times, one needs to make sure that one does not always say yes. One needs to have the strength of character to refuse taking on assignments where there is no desire or need to act unethically. And then important, don't be a frog. It's interesting to note that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump out. If, however, you put a frog in cold water, put it on a stove, and then heat it up, it will actually die in the pot. And what is the ethical educational lesson? Is that if you start getting yourself in hot water, eventually one loses one's perspective, and then anything becomes justifiable. So avoid taking those minor ethical infringements which you know aren't right, because eventually it leads down a terrible cliff. Important, mind your own business. You know, if you don't need to know about certain things, don't ask. Obviously, from an audit perspective, if that's the area in which you operate, or tax, or any other service that you offer, you need to make sure that you have a full understanding of the business and the risks. But, you know, if it's something that doesn't involve you, well, don't make it your business. And then very importantly, lead by example. That idea of setting an ethical corporate culture is what will benefit everyone. So in terms of timing, I think these are aspects that you can sort of apply in your own mind. It's nothing I don't think that we need to go through to discuss it at this stage in terms of the presentation. You're welcome to work through this on page 18 of your workbook, should you desire, but I think we're going to just be moving on. In terms of then some of the pitfalls and excuses as to why people don't land up making correct ethical decisions, sometimes taking the ethical stand is too difficult. It means that there's consequences. I think we've seen that very much in the South African society for those people that have actually stood the moral ground. But I think we need to realize that the impact of not taking it is far worse. Sometimes we feel disempowered. Well, what can I, measly little me, Edwin Selbst, actually do? But we need to realize that these moral dilemmas, they get noticed in the workplace, and there's definitely some course of action that can be taken, even if it's just prodding the right person to take that necessary action. Sometimes one is obscured from financial reasons because of one's job. One isn't willing to sacrifice your children, or one sometimes is blinded to loyalty to somebody else or to the organization. One needs to just be very careful and be aware that this can have huge impacts for entities, for stakeholders, as well as ultimately yourself in the long run. Another excuse that's been used to excuse many atrocities, many ethical, immoral decisions is, I'm just following orders. I'm just on robot. I'm just executing my responsibilities. The question of split loyalties. We've seen it in government. I've actually come across it recently in a external quality control review. That's an area in which I specialize in, where the corporates have had huge breaches in their procurement policies, and the subordinates saying, well, I was just following the boss's orders. But remember, it's that person, if that's your job, well, then that person is ultimately party to the transaction. And another famous excuse is, I didn't have the time. It's crucial that every person evaluates the potential ethical dilemmas properly, and they need to make sure that they give themselves sufficient time to consider the implications of all affected parties, so that they can then make a better informed ethical decision. So, benefits of following a code of ethics is happier employees, people that are willing to come to work because they know that the organization is acting in the interests of all stakeholders. More consistent decisions. And more committed employees, we spoke about better productivity. So in terms of general ethics, there are then specific codes of ethics that take a person's behaviors and codifies that into specific actions. Now, there are some very famous codes of ethics. There's the 10 Commandments as to what's been put out there, what's right or wrong. There are also there's the rotary four-way test, which we'll discuss. The Minnesota principles developed in the US. The US banking ethical principles by which all banks need to operate. And then the one that hopefully most of us are familiar with is the RBA Code of Professional Conduct, or SACA's Code of Ethics. And the advantage of having a code, as we've said, is to standardize and ensure consistent application of different business ethical decisions based on persons' different moral upbringing and maturity. So hopefully we're familiar with the 10 Commandments. Primary ones being don't steal, don't murder. But I think it's theft in the business context that has a direct implication in terms of most codes, as we'll see. The rotary four-way test looks at, of the things we think and say or do, how do we evaluate that? Is it a truth? Is it fair? Will it build goodwill and respect and better relationships? And will it be beneficial to all those concerned? The Minnesota principles, very similar. That looks at, from the proposition of stimulating economic growth, is the behavior likely to result in a contribution to business or the larger society? All business activities must be characterized by fairness. Business activities must be honest, and there must be respect of human dignity, and business activities must be characterized by respect for the environment. A comment by one of the delegates, Albert Einstein, said that one should never act against one's conscience, even if required to do so by the state. So what determines conscience is very important. I think, yeah, that's how you avoid those ethical challenges, those ethical nights, sleepless nights where you've been confronted by something but you're not comfortable with it. Thanks for that comment. In terms of the US banking principles, once again, similar ideas: uncompromising integrity, respect, responsibility. It's not about me, it's not about I. And then good citizenship. When we look at the code of ethics from a corporate responsibility, and particularly for professional accountants, so then we have the following principles, which hopefully you're all familiar with: integrity, acting honestly, and remember, honesty includes being objective. It means not only saying what is correct, but also not leaving out things which you know could distort. Independence, I think we've spoken about quite a lot this morning already, this afternoon already, so I don't have much to add on that. And then making sure that one is sufficiently up to date with the technical requirements of one's profession, because if you don't have the knowledge, how are you able to act honestly, objectively, independently without the necessary technical knowledge? From an objectivity perspective, being fair, having respect for others, applying that professional behavior through respect, good citizenship, social responsibility, confidentiality, that deals to the aspects of professional behavior. And I think it's important to realize that these positive aspects of the code lead to better behavior, lead to a way in which people are able to interact with each other, and under circumstances where there's a level of trust and mutual benefit to the parties with whom we're interacting. So in terms then of current issues that we as practitioners need to focus on in terms of the ROBA's and CICA's current codes. The first, I would say, is, if you think of it, there's all requirements around CPD. I mean, that's what this course is about. That's what CPD Gauteng, Danny and Stan are running this to try and give you those technical skills. And linked to that is an ethical responsibility to make sure that you develop for the benefit of yourself and to service your clients. There's declarations that take place on an annual basis. I know, for example, that Danny, in conjunction with Sorry Consulting, that's the company I work for, has done training on NOCLAR, non-compliance with laws and regulations. There's specific technical detail that applies to all professional accountants, whether you're operating in business or in public practice, as to how you need to behave if you discover non-compliance by your clients. The other aspects that come to mind is, when you're making your declaration, are you acting with integrity? Very importantly, we have a responsibility in terms of the code of ethics to report non-compliance. If the client, even if this is from a tax perspective, if the client is not willing to rectify their tax affairs, well, you as a professional accountant have a responsibility to act. Are you doing that in an appropriate and ethical manner? Some of the other aspects deal with independence and rotation requirements. I've got a client that's actually I'm consulting, a small audit firm in the Free State, where they're concerned that some of their services that they're offering are not in compliance with the Companies Act or the code. And we've set up an initial discussion, which then focuses the work that they need to do to establish which areas are potentially in conflict, with an objective then of a further consultation as to exactly how we then are going to resolve those matters. So I think we all have challenges that we need to deal with. Other aspects from an ROBA perspective is a public interest entity. if you do deal with certain public interest entities and don't say, well, I don't audit any listed entities, the RBA code says each firm needs to classify based on their client base which entities are considered public interest entities. And therefore, there are certain additional requirements that need to be adhered to. There's also, if you are involved in the audit of, that's one of the services that you offer, there's rotation requirements in terms of the Companies Act. There's rotation requirements in terms of long association of personnel. Interesting to know that Tesco, the manufacturing company in the UK, I can't remember if it's the UK or the US, so it's the UK if I recall, where the UK have introduced retendering requirements every 10 years. It was found out that PwC was the auditor since 1983. It's I'm a little older than that. Important that if we do have non-assurance services, we need to make sure that we evaluate them appropriately, because if this is found out by the regulator, because it is an ethical breach, it's an immediate referral to investigations. Doesn't even, to disciplinary. Doesn't even sit necessarily with investigations or a person given an opportunity, because it is clearly contrary to the law. So I think also we have responsibilities from an RBA perspective if you're an auditor, and from a Companies Act perspective if you're engaged in performing independent reviews. CIPC has communicated to SICA on numerous occasions that they're not getting the reportable irregularities for review engagements. I think with regard then to, some of the other aspects on this that I'd like to address before we move forward is around the aspect of when it comes to different services that you're offering, but very importantly, how you evaluate your clients, how you evaluate your clients' compliance with laws and regulations. If an entity isn't preparing financial statements within 6 months, that's a Companies Act requirement. If an organization has not submitted tax returns for a number of periods, we have an ethical responsibility to act under those circumstances in terms of the code, the SICA code or the RBA code. Both have no-claw requirements. I think that we need to also evaluate our responsibilities and our clients. Yes, we're operating in a tough economic environment. You know, I'm aware of a situation where a auditing firm, from a reputational perspective, refused to take on the work of a particular rogue because of their, let's just say, suspect dealings. The news only broke much later, but because there were rumors already, they turned down the contract to act for them on in the person's tax matters. I think when it comes then to other areas in which we need to focus on, we need to be aware that there is enhanced requirements for independence requirements for public interest entities. We need to make sure that our public interest entities have been clearly defined, that we look at what those public interest entities are, and we ensure that we follow the requirements as set out by the auditing standards in those regards. Remember, from a review engagement perspective, the reviewer does not need to rotate, but the reviewer cannot compile the financial statements, because then it's a self-review threat. So am I just ticking the boxes and I'm putting in mirrors and smoke to make it appear as if there is compliance? But really, deep down, I know the true situation. For those of you in the auditing space, there's additional requirements. We've discussed those at the previous ethics courses I've run as to rotation requirements. One needs to be aware of these. For public interest entities as well as for statutory audits, the following would create self-review threats. Tax services in terms of tax consulting, valuation services, internal audit to an audit client, IT services, recruitment of directors and managers. You're then going to be responsible for the person that is ultimately employed, which is going to have to report indirectly to yourself. These are changes to the codes that have been clarified. There are some recently, some have been in existence for a while. And then there's specific requirements around when a client becomes a public interest entity. Like I said, this is applicable to every small and medium-sized firm as well, because of the requirement in the code to define what a public interest entity is. And that definition includes consideration of matters such as, is there, based on turnover, based on number of employees, those public interest score matters that are incorporated in the Companies Act have found their way into the code as well, from a general perspective. With regards to non-assurance, so if you've got a public interest entity, are you allowed to provide certain services? Some, yes, in an emergency circumstance, but then does that land up becoming ongoing? Very importantly, that one cannot assume a management role, and I think that's important in no matter what level of consulting you provide to your clients, even for non-public interest entities, where you are taking on a management role, where you are ultimately responsible for the decision making, that creates a self-review threat, particularly if you're going to be doing an audit or review at a later stage. Important to realize that no bookkeeping and tax consulting can be given even in emergency situations. Remember, the Companies Act is even more stringent. It says if you've been associated in the past 5 years with writing up the books, you cannot provide assurance, which is audits. There's further guidance that has been enhanced to the types of management services and how that could affect your behavior from an ethical perspective. And then from a perspective of non-assurance services, where you provide assurance to those clients that are not audits, so it could be other forms of assurance, royalty audits, those sort of aspects. There additional clarification that one is not allowed to perform certain services. So overall, I think it's important to realize that the key to an ethical office is seeing things as they are and not as you want them to be. We are blinded by our own desires. Leading by example can't be stressed enough. Important to have an empathetic ear, be committed to becoming involved in the process. One needs to have the ability to predict ethical conflicts so that you can address them before they arrive and timeously. One needs to communicate them well and form a habit by talking honestly, constantly, and establishing that language of ethics. I don't know if there's any questions or anything. Please feel free to submit them. Other aspects to consider is making sure that while you may be aware that people may have different levels of moral and ethical responsibilities, one needs to make sure that one considers this when you're interacting with people. And then remember that people are normally not as ethical as they think they are. Often we find that we have situations where, as you discuss things with people, so you find out how they've actually been conducting their business, sometimes some unsavory practices. And then important to define ethical expectations early in the relationship. Set that tone up front, what is acceptable, what you expect from the relationship. Consistency and predictability are key aspects. One needs to make sure that one pays attention to the details so that one can understand the nuances and the different ramifications of different scenarios. One needs to be objective and have that ability to question your own decisions. I have a group of people where I'm faced with my own ethical decisions. I engage with them and get an objective view. It's important to develop a team which can then help you, where you can bounce your ethical challenges off, and then learn not to judge the ethical tracks by overthinking or cynicism, whereby you evaluate things and dismiss things or become critical of something or try and laugh at it. Important that we realize that virtue is its own good reward, and one must have the courage to speak up when one sees unethical behavior or where you sense that your ethical playground is being treaded upon or spoiled. So, how then do we go about achieving an ethical office? So, there's various principles and decision-making tools that one can employ. And in terms of, it was interesting, there was a CNBC interview with the chairman of one of the big four auditing firms. And the chairman of that firm was asked by the interviewer, how do you hedge your risks? And the response was, we make sure the tone at the top is right with a commitment to doing the right thing. And this is communicated to the entire employee base of over 100,000 employees on a continual basis. Interestingly, a month later, there was an article in Forbes magazine where the same auditing firm was being sued for $1 billion for entertaining clients that operated illegal tax shelters. And I think we've all seen where it's easy to talk ethics, but what we need to do is live ethics. And the basic principles to help in ethical decision making is to put yourself in another person's shoes, to try and evaluate, do you have all the information, and look at the problems through the various principles that we've been discussing today with the different philosophies to arrive at an informed decision. To get a bit more practical, some people that I've presented courses to have said, well, that's very nice in principle, but how then do I actually go about applying something to evaluating my ethical decisions? So we're going to discuss a couple of different decision-making tools. The first is something called the smell test. It's how would you feel about this decision? How would you explain it to another party? Be that your children, be that a colleague, be that the regulator. And remember, sometimes it's not about whether or not I agree with it or not. It's a question about what does it say and how have I acted? There are people that believe some of the requirements in the Companies Act are archaic and create unnecessary costs. Unfortunately, the time to debate that has long fallen away, because when SAICA was aware of the changes that were coming, they asked practitioners to get their feedback, and they submitted comments. Now we need to say, well, based on the actions that a person is taking, how would you relate that to a colleague? Is the decision actually explainable? How would I feel if this decision that I took got the headlines in the news, or became a story on one of the newspapers or talk shows? Is this a decision that will keep me up at night? Is this something I can live with? How would someone beloved to you feel? Your mother, your dad, your spouse? That's called the smell test. That's one of the ways in which you can help evaluate your ethical decisions. There are others that are a bit more structured, and that's called, one of which is called the Potter box. And we'll take a look at each of the steps. We start with the action or the policy that's potentially caused the dilemma or is being challenged. We then analyze the situation to determine what is the potential impact. We then look, after we've got all the facts, we look at which values are then potentially being challenged. Is this integrity? Is it loyalty? Is it confidentiality? We look then at the principles that are in the code and see what are the principles that need to be applied under the circumstances. And then we look at, are there any loyalties that may be affecting my action that could impair my objectivity. And then we arrive at an action which hopefully is ethical. Don't know if there's any questions, otherwise I'll just be moving forward. So, in terms of then the other possible approaches, so I just want to get rid of those markings. Give me a sec. I didn't realize they would stay for the next slide. Right. Okay. So another ethical decision-making tool is the Kidder process. This was developed by Rushworth Kidder, and it's a 9-step process that looks at helping a person sort out ethical issues. Some people find this process more practical and easier to use than other approaches that we may have discussed. And the way in which the model works is, the first thing that one needs to look at is recognize that there's a moral dilemma and try and define that dilemma as accurately as possible. You then determine who the actors are or who potentially could be affected by the decision that is being contemplated. Do further research to obtain all the necessary information and test for right versus wrong. Because if there's something that is clearly not allowed, an action that is prohibited, well, then one needs to then make sure that one evaluates that and one steers away from that, because that's not an ethical issue. That becomes sometimes a moral or legal decision that cannot be taken. We then go down to the second row and then test for those gray areas, those right versus wrong, in terms of, are there any potential paradigms, any other influences that may affect the issue? There may be matters such as truth versus loyalty that are conflicting, self versus community, short-term versus long-term, justice versus mercy. These sort of aspects, these paradigms may have an influence on your ethical behavior. We then look at applying the resolution principles, where we look at different models that may be appropriate. We spoke about the golden rule. We spoke about the mean process, the utilitarianism, these sort of principles then to try and help us arrive at a decision. We then investigate different options. What are the possible courses of action that we could take under the circumstances? We then make a decision, and very importantly, take a step back and reflect on that decision to see whether or not the decision we have taken, is it appropriate? So, in terms of then applying this, another scenario for you. You're the assistant for the president of your company's marketing department. One of the major stipulations of the company's code of ethics is that employees are not allowed to accept freebies. You notice an entry in your boss's calendar for a gala sponsored by one of the company's clients. What do you do? Your thoughts, please. So now we're almost out of time, so I think I'll just try and fast track this. But you could discuss this with your boss. You could see if there's anybody else you could report this to. You need to evaluate what the impact is on your own personal circumstances. But I do think that there needs to be action. If your boss is known to be very confrontational, well, then obviously discussing it with your boss is not appropriate. Maybe you need to communicate this to the external audit, to the internal audit, if there's an internal audit function, or to somebody else who has an ability to take certain decisions. I think the other scenarios, I don't think this one we need to address. What I would just like to finish off with is that that we need to make sure that when it comes to ethical decisions, clients can request that we do something unethical for a number of reasons. Sometimes it may be unintentional. They may not know. I had a chartered accountant as a client who actually couldn't understand the difference between the legal entity and himself. It was scary to deal with, but eventually we moved on to deal with things and to in a way where the corporate veil was not pierced. There are types of decisions that require a person to be ethically fit. We need to we can't allow our clients to determine where on the ethical ladder we'll be sitting. You need to know where your line is, where your company's line is, and make sure that that line is sufficiently clear and that you will not cross it. And you need to have mental processes in place to make sure that you act and have the tools to be able to act in the required manner. Important to continue beyond the information that has been given to make sure that you evaluate all possible courses of action and then ultimately make a decision. Some examples to consider for you to deliberate on is the taxman won't notice if you put that expense as a business expense. Do you need to qualify the audit report that there's definitely not a going concern problem? I've heard other scenarios. Yeah, but you'll be putting a lot of people out of work. We can always get a new auditor who would appreciate our business. There's a client of mine that told me a story where he was, they put in a tender, they were told that they didn't get the job. A month later, they were asked if they could come and do the audit. And then a week before they were about to sign off, they met the third group of auditors that had just been appointed because nobody was willing to sign off on the unethical practices that the client wanted people to commit. Can you change your opinion if we increase the fee? Put another way, are you bribable? And the value is based on judgment, and I'm sure we can increase it to display a net asset position. So, I think we need to then, if you're faced with ethical challenges, you need to have a response that you're comfortable with. I'm not really comfortable doing that. They may not be aware that this request is unethical. Some of the responses I've used is, thanks very much for your email, but please be aware I'm unable to assist you in not complying with your ethical responsibilities. This process may work in some circumstances. Another example is to have a sit-down meeting at an appropriate time and place. Paraphrase the requests with other parties to evaluate this. be firm and say no if the person tries to be insistent. Plan C would be reconsider the situation and your commitments. Talk to other people. Very important from a no-CLAR perspective, you have a responsibility to document your professional judgment. And if it really becomes sticky, you may need to get a lawyer or escalate the matter further. You know, in closing, a couple of points. The burden of ethics falls upon those in power. Supervisors have a responsibility of setting good ethical relationships and standards of conduct. And the less closely policed lower level staff are, the higher level staff are less policed and therefore may feel they can get away with things. And that's why it's important to have that culture. In terms of, if you have made an ethical mistake, accept reality, learn from your experience, forgive yourself, boost your self-esteem, reconnect, and get on with life. One needs to take corrective action to make sure that one doesn't repeat these actions. I think we've discussed these matters in sufficient detail. So remember, in terms of acting ethically, choose ethical leaders. Make sure that you are independent, that you have people that can challenge you, or a reach out, a consultant that you can deal with. Make sure that you have a living code of ethics. It's not just something that sits on the internet. Explain the reasons behind the code to other people as well as your staff and clients, and apply ethical standards to everyone. The last couple of slides are just those points that have been jotted down for your consideration, just to keep your mind fresh. So I hope you've enjoyed the session, and if you do have any questions, I'm happy to take them shortly. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Edwin. That was most fascinating, and I mean, a lot of food for thought. You've itemized all the points at the end, and I think there's a lot of points to consider. So yes, it's really eye-opening and in some cases eye-watering. But thank you again, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Your certificates will be sent to you over the course of the next few days. And thank you once again, and thank you, Danny, for what you've done and the part you play in getting all of this together and the actual technology behind the scenes. So thank you, everybody, and good night, and stay ethical and be responsible. And what more can one say?
Okay, thanks then. Cheers, everyone. I will be around if there's any questions for a couple of minutes. Thanks then.
Yeah, if anyone wants to ask questions, they can raise a hand or something, and I can unmute them to ask.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. If there's no more questions or anything, I'm going to be logging off. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.